Welcome to our What is a Disciple Making Church webinar. I'm glad that you've had a chance to join us. Some of you are actually logged on and watching live. Others of you are watching via the recording. Either way, we're glad that you're with us as we explore this topic of what it means to be a disciple-making church. As we look at some of these issues, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Scott Corwin, and I'm the director of the Building Connections Core Strategy for the International Baptist Convention. And our goal for today is for us to try to help us as a group, particularly in the IBC, identify exactly what it means to be a disciple-making church. It's an important question for us, primarily because our mission states that we are to be disciple-making churches. Our mission, we exist to mobilize and multiply disciple-making churches, leads to a very understandable question, and that is, what is a disciple-making church? So today we hope to kind of circle this question with some wisdom and input from one of our own. And so we want to welcome you, as well as welcoming Tim Faulkner, who is our president, as well as pastor of one of our churches in Naples. Tim, welcome, and thank you for being willing to present to us today.
Thanks, Scott. My pleasure. It's good to
Tell us just a little bit about yourself. What's one thing that we don't know about you that we ought to know?
That I have a couple holes in one in my life.
Oh, wow. That's something I didn't know.
Yeah, it's I don't know, the beginner luck in me, I guess. But, yeah, I'm a person who loves sports and loves playing different sports. Try to learn what I can of the fundamentals, and once in a while I hit it where it's supposed to go. So.
Well, that's one of the reasons I like golf, because you don't expect to hit your goal all the time.
That's right.
It's at work. Well, you're also a person that's passionate about disciple making, and that's one thing that I appreciate about you, and I'm happy to have you presenting to us today. There's a number of other people that are with us. If you would, just let's just go through and just introduce yourselves, who's on, so that when we hear questions a little bit later, we'll know who's on. So Jimmy, if you would start and just say hi and introduce yourself to us.
Hi, Jimmy Martin. I live in Frankfurt, Germany, and I am a member of International Christian Fellowship in Oberursel, which is just outside of Frankfurt, and I also serve as the IBC General Secretary.
Thanks, Jimmy. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Daryl, introduce yourself to us, if you would, please, sir.
Yes, I think good afternoon for most of you. It's good morning for me. I'm based here at the IBC's Church Multiplication Office in San Antonio, Texas, also known as my house. And so, yeah, I'm the director of church multiplication for IBC, and excited to be in this conversation, because if it's not a disciple-making church, then I'm not so sure it's worth multiplying. So I'm happy to be here.
Good point. Thanks, Daryl. Thank you for that. Judith Lynn, if you would, just introduce yourself to us, please.
I'm Judith Lynn Maxwell. I am a member of Darmstadt's Convergent International Fellowship in Germany, and also serve as the Director of Developing Resources for the convention. But I'm here today in my role as heading up the focus of discipleship at our local church. So.
That's great. Thank you. I'm glad that you've joined us. Thank you, Judith Lynn. Paul, introduce yourself to us, please. See if I can help you there. Unmute your microphone there. Paul, are you with us?
I'm here. Let's see. I don't know why you're not getting me.
We got you now.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. Paul Arneson, I'm pastor at the International Baptist Church in Sofia, Bulgaria.
Fantastic. We're glad that you've joined us. Glad that you're here.
Thank you.
Well, all of us together will try to help resolve some of the questions around what is a disciple-making church. In order for us to kind of get at that, let me just make mention of a couple of things here. This is an audio-only webinar, so that the only video you'll see will be mine and Tim's as host and presenter. Use a wired connection if possible if you have some problems with your reception or connection. Mute your microphone if you are not speaking during the question and answer time. That's helpful to eliminate some background noise. There is a series of things that you can use down at the bottom of your screen, like chat, the raised hand, question and answer kind of a thing. If you need some direction in doing that, here's some things that you might see on a screen. You'll notice that there's an audio settings on the lower left-hand side. If you need to, just go ahead and test your audio and video settings accordingly. At the same time, there's also a place down at the lower side of your screen to raise your hand. You can raise your hand and it will identify the fact that you want to say something. So Jimmy just raised his hand. Thank you, sir. The other thing is there is a place for you to actually do questions and answers. You can click on there and you can type in your question. It will be helpful during the presentation if you'll do that, and I can kind of field some of those questions and feed them to Tim, and that would be a big help if you'll just be happy to do that. So those are just some of the housekeeping matters that are at hand. And I appreciate your using those during the course of our webinar. What is a disciple-making church is a question that plagues us and invites us to prayerfully consider. What does the Bible have to say? How do we put that into practice in the lives of our churches? So, Tim, I'm happy to just invite you to guide us in a conversation as we think about answering that question. What is a disciple-making church?
Well, there's a number of ways we could answer that question, I think. One is that we have an idea of what we're trying to produce, what a disciple looks like, and that the people that we serve alongside of have a clear idea of what that looks like and where we're going. We need to have a process. One of the things that I discovered, unfortunately, early in my time before coming to Italy over 20 years ago was that while everyone that I met aspirationally wanted to make disciples, when posed the question, how are you making disciples, it got a little fuzzy. There were very few people who could tell me what their pathway was to get someone from being a newborn in Christ to being a mature, reproducing believer. And so there has to be some kind of a pathway, some kind of a process in a disciple-making church. And I would say I'm learning, as I get older, that there's a lot out there and you get overwhelmed. And I think the simpler it can be, the more reproducible it can be, the better off we are if we're going to make any progress together. Those would just be my initial thoughts.
Good. So some kind of a process, knowing where you're going, having a goal in mind, what is a disciple, and making sure that it is indeed reproducible. Otherwise, it's not really multiplying disciples or making disciples who make disciples. So, that's right. Okay. How would you guide us through that particular conversation? How would you start that?
Well, we could start with a definition of a disciple. One that I like is one that was developed, I think, by Jim Putman and the guys at Real Life.
Sorry.
That's okay. You're messing with us here.
I am. That was me. Sorry about that.
And it's just a shape. It's a triangle, and with the numbers 419 in the middle, comes from Matthew 4:19. Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And it contains three elements of a disciple, a person who follows Jesus, someone who's being changed by Jesus, in that case, made into fishers of men, and on mission with Jesus. And so early on, Jesus is calling the disciples and telling them what they're going to become long before he leaves them with the Great Commission. But this is the kind of definition I like because it's something that I don't have trouble remembering. It's something that I can communicate to others, and then they can communicate it to others as well. It may not satisfy everyone as being a complete definition, but I think it contains essentially what you need to have in what you're looking for in a disciple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's concise, it's simple, it's streamlined, and it's also reproducible. It fits some of the things that you were talking about. There's a process that is implied here as well, is there not?
Yes. Yeah, following is the first step, and the transformation is what allows us to please our Father and to ultimately engage in his purpose for us, which is the mission that Jesus left us.
Okay. So having identified, clearly defined a disciple, then that gives us a target that we can move toward, we can aim for when it comes to making disciples. As we look at this in the diagram here, a good question is what does that H stand for in the diagram, Tim?
I was afraid you were going to ask me that. I'm not quite sure.
Well, it wasn't me that asked it. Blame Jimmy, because he's the one that always comes up with good
job, Jimmy. Yeah, I'm wondering that myself. So guess what? We're all going to have to do a little research on that one. I didn't come prepared with that.
I'll try to make something up in between now and the end of the webinar that makes sense.
Okay, sounds good.
That's great. So with this as a definition of sight, any other questions you have, please feel free to write them in. Thanks, Jimmy, for writing in a question there. But with this as a beginning point, where do we go from here? What do we move toward?
Well, I think there's always the question of the relationship between disciple making on an individual basis and then the disciple making that is part of who we are as a corporate body belonging to the church. And so, what does it look like to be disciple making churches? Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you had this book years ago when I was going through Bible college, we studied a book called Sharpening the Focus of the Church by a guy named Gene Getz. And he talked about form and function, and, that comes through the lenses of scripture, culture, and history. And so we create all these forms in our churches to carry out the functions that we find in scripture, and they make up the activities that keep the churches alive, right? The dynamics of the local church. And sometimes it feels like we're the tail wagging the dog when it comes to the activities. And as disciple-making churches, one of the questions we have to ask is, what are the activities that we need to be engaged in that will actually help us to become and continue to be disciple makers? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the analogies that I found helpful in recent years is in the book, The Trellis and the Vine, which describes the life of the work that we need to do in the form of the vine and the support structure in the trellis. And the analogy is something like a gardener who has a couple trellises in the backyard, and one trellis is beautiful. It's all nicely varnished and everything, but there's no vine there. Then there's this other trellis, and it's falling apart, starting to rot, may need to be replaced because it's under the weight of this big vine that's growing up. And obviously, that's why it exists, to be there in support of the vine. And sometimes we can fall into the trap of being more focused on the trellis than we are on the vine. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that became for me like a matrix when it comes to corporate disciple making or helping people become disciple makers. Asking myself, is everything we're doing here helping the people in my church and me to be disciple makers? If not, then maybe it's an activity that should go away, because it's becoming trellis work as opposed to vine work. And ultimately, we want the vine to be growing.
I find that distinction between the individual and the corporate disciple making to be helpful. Each of us as individuals are to be disciple makers, but in the context of the church, our functions as a church should focus on that issue of making disciples, and the form should contribute to that. I find that to be a helpful distinction. Thanks for that notion, that idea.
That doesn't make it any easier to carry it out.
No, it doesn't, does it? It doesn't. Well, how do we accomplish that? How do we move toward that?
Well, I think we just have, it becomes a helpful way of evaluating what we're doing and getting to what we really need to be focusing on, making disciples. So I think it becomes a place to start for us to have the conversation and to do the evaluation of what we're doing and why we continue to do what we're doing. And a way of engaging our people in the process as well, those that are partnering with us in disciple making, to ask ourselves how we're doing at making disciples.
Okay, good point. Let's pause at this point and see if anybody has any questions or comments that they would like to sort of add to the discussion. You can either raise your hand or just unmute your microphone and share with us.
Yeah, Scott and Tim, I resonate with that conversation about the corporate and the personal disciple-making aspects. In my experience, study and understanding, I'm convicted that the most, to be the most effective disciple-making churches are going to be those who truly have a disciple-making ethos. The church has got to live and breathe disciple making. Everything they do has to point towards disciple making. The structure, the environment, the culture, every activity needs to point. I think Tim mentioned that, needs to point towards, contribute to disciple making. So one, I'd say corporately, a disciple making ethos. And then secondly, on the corporate level, that there needs to be, the church needs to really have a consciousness of their community, the people they're reaching out to. They just really need to know the people in their context, so that their approaches to disciple making will be filtered or seen through the lenses appropriately for that particular community. When I think like the transient community, if I'm thinking about a college community, if I'm thinking about a rural community, we really need to understand those people. So just a couple of comments there.
Good insights there, Daryl. Thanks. Contextualizing disciple making in our setting may look differently from one place to the other, but it will still be focused on that disciple making function of who we are, not only as individuals but as the church. Thanks for that. Jimmy, you had a comment you wanted to make?
Yeah, just I think I appreciate Tim's point about starting a conversation as a church. It's very easy for us to look at everything we do as related to disciple making, and perhaps in some ways, most everything we do is related to disciple making, but I think by asking the question, it helps us to evaluate, if we can only choose 3 things, which 3 are the most important and out of the 10 that we have. And so I think, this question can help us to ask some difficult questions that could lead us to more directed disciple making.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned it, Jimmy, and Tim did as well, this whole business of sort of measuring or evaluating our effectiveness. And that has to come out of disciple making. And wrestling with this issue does help us evaluate and measure our success of becoming a multiplying or value disciple-making church. Did I do that, or did you, Tim?
I did.
Oh, all right, there we go. You're moving to that. There we go. Go ahead.
Well, I just was thinking as you were talking about measuring that this is an apt analogy, I think. I don't know. I think it's the 4 executions of a team, the idea of lead and lag measures. How do we tend to measure our disciple making? Nickels and noses, right? We say, or, we tend to measure attendance and giving in our churches. We tend to measure baptisms and conversions. And those are all measurements that we can use that are quantifiable. How do we get to the measurements of what we want to see as the ultimate product of our discipleship? One of the things that I struggle with, I don't know about the rest of you, is that by measuring conversions and baptisms, essentially we're measuring spiritual infancy, which is wonderful, but it's not the goal of where we want to be, spiritual parenthood. And so how can we get those kinds of measures in front of our church? And might there also be, so that could be represented, by this big green top to the carrot, but what about all that other stuff that you don't see? Are we measuring those things as well? How many people am I talking to this week about Christ? How many people are in my spiritual garden, if we use those kinds of tools to pray for, these contacts, these people of peace? How many conversations am I having? How many times am I presenting the gospel? How many people are engaged with me in learning to share their faith with others? That kind of, to me, answers the question of what are the lead, not just the lag measures. But am I putting into my disciple making what would lead to a multiplication, even if I don't see the results yet? That's a different kind of measure. Any thoughts on that?
I would fully agree, and just to say that the spiritual parenthood is a higher goal than baptisms and attendance, although those two things are very important. It's hard to measure how many people are exhibiting the fruit of the Spirit, how many people are ministering to the hurting people around them. And those things are much more difficult to put a number to, if we even need to put a number to.
That's right.
That's very true. It makes it very difficult to actually measure in ways that we're accustomed to. And it also invites us to think differently about how we go about our function of making disciples. Another thing that kind of came out there, at least for me, is too often we think of discipleship of something that is a dynamic of our relationship with other believers. And yet a part of that disciple making process is connected to our relationship with non-believers. Could you expand upon that just a little bit, Tim?
Yeah, that's been something that's really become more of an awareness for me recently. I would say almost a paradigm shift is that discipleship for me begins before a person becomes a believer. And so even while they're in the state of spiritual death and they haven't yet experienced the life-changing power of the gospel, I'm beginning to disciple them. And I think with that perspective, it gives me more of a focus on the long term. Where am I taking them ultimately? My goal isn't just to bring them into the kingdom. It isn't just that first step. There's a whole journey that I want to take with this person or see them take. So that's what it's done for me, thinking about this in terms of, what we might call pre-evangelism, but discipleship starting before we even know where that person stands with the Lord.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In the past, I've heard that described as either discipleship evangelism or evangelistic discipleship. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? And it becomes one of those circumstances and situations. Anybody else have another question or a comment before we kind of move to the next part of what we're looking at?
Maybe just a word about our church has just recently developed a new mission and vision statement using the trellis and the vine. And I think that one of the analogies that they use in the trellis and the vine is helping people wherever they are to take a step to the right. So if they're in pre-conversion, you're helping to, first of all, just expose them to the gospel. So each step that they take, you're trying to move them more towards spiritual maturity, but you take a person where they are. And I think that's what Tim was saying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is a good analogy, especially for us from Texas and this whole business of line dancing and things like that. Take a step to the right.
Scott, I would also make just a quick comment, if I could, on Jimmy's comment about it being some things being very difficult to measure, like the fruit of the Spirit being produced or evidence in someone's life, or those real kind of maybe intangible things. But on the positive side of that, I think the most effective disciple making is going to happen. We're talking about corporate and personal. It's going to happen in the personal context, in the context of a personal relationship. And it's been my experience that in that personal relationship, I can very much so, so be it a subjective approach, I can very much so measure, if you will, testify to the fruit being exhibited in this person's life, the transformation I'm seeing right before my eyes. Mm-hmm. I don't know about putting a number on it, but I can tell you, yes, this guy I'm in disciple group with, he's growing leaps and bounds. I'm seeing this, I'm seeing this, he's doing this. Mm-hmm. So not as easy to throw a number on as attendance, but it can, it can be.
Hard to measure in some of the traditional ways, for sure. Recent article that I read was the result of a poll done by the Barna Group, and it said something about the attributes of discipleship. I'm going to just interject this. I'm going to launch a poll now and just take an opportunity to answer this question, if you will. It's this idea of these are the following 8 attributes of discipleship that were most important, or at least indicated in the research that Barna has done. Of these, which do you think are most important to disciple making? You can choose whichever ones you want. Some of you might choose them all because they are the top 8. But just go ahead and give us some feedback there on which ones of these you think are important, while thinking about how might you go about measuring these characteristics of discipleship. At the same time, how is it that a church what functions would a church engage in that could help contribute to these kinds of things? So what would you say are the most important in your opinion? for discipleship. Yep. We've got, yeah, somebody said all of those, there we go. These are the ones that I think are a little bit challenging to measure, perhaps. All right, you can see there on your screen. Let me share the results. I'm going to end it there. Take a chance just to put your answers in there if you would, real quickly. And I'm going to end it, and I'm going to share these results with you here as we just kind of looked at this. Okay, polling is now closed, and let me share these response with you here. Here's the results that we said. All of them appear to be important, but how would you measure some of these? How might you think about that as we measure that success?
I think the obedience and the transparency kind of run together. When I think about sharing measured results of spiritual parenthood, I think about people's stories. Mm-hmm. Which means that we have to have people in front of us who are modeling the kind of disciple making that we're looking for and are willing to share their joys and their struggles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Storying, important. Sharing relationships is something that Daryl mentioned earlier, that whole business of engaging one another that way. Somebody else, just your thoughts?
Yeah, again, I just say, in the context of a personal relationship with someone that I'm discipling or in a disciple group with, we routinely and intentionally talk about our ongoing conversation with God, our ongoing Bible study and engagement in the Word, our ongoing, faithful obedience to what God is speaking to us and what the Word says. And so, as we have those conversations in a relationship to measuring these things, again, I can go back and say, this is this person's degree of Bible engagement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Their obedience, they're sharing the gospel. They're not really easy to put a number on it, but I can gauge it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Subjectively, of course.
Certainly, and that invites us to try to get at the question here. If these are things that we are saying are important, and we move towards measuring them. The question then is, how do we as churches structure ourselves functioning as a disciple-making church? I'm going to stop the share, and we're going to move on with the next part of our conversation. How do we move toward this? Paul, you have a question, or you would care to comment there? Go ahead.
Yeah. I was just thinking, maybe I've missed it, but have we talked about the role of disciples making disciples? When Jesus made disciples, that wasn't the end of the story, obviously. They were to make disciples. How does that show up either in that poll we took, or where does that show up in our efforts to make sure that the people we are discipling are in turn making disciples as well? I use the analogy of the role of an apple tree. The role of an apple tree, what is it? Everybody says to make apples. No, it's to make more apple trees. Similar kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Very good point. And it didn't necessarily show up in that poll, did it? What would you say in response to Paul's comment, Tim?
Well, I would say I think we're addressing the same kind of idea, maybe not has been that specific. The idea of disciples making disciples, I think, is related to obedience, sharing Christ, developing relationships. I'm not quite sure how your question differs from being a disciple-making church, unless it's just that we haven't stated it explicitly.
Yeah, just to respond to that, Tim, I think one of the challenges I seem to run into with people is they're willing to embrace becoming a disciple, less likely to embrace making disciples.
Yeah.
Themselves, and that's all. And I think you're right. I think it has to do with building relationships and the other things you mentioned there. So, but it is another way to measure too. I mean, people generally know or can be challenged. Who are you bringing along in this process that I'm bringing you along in, or that you're learning these basics about discipleship? Are you sharing them with anyone, and how's that going for you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Maybe this touches a little bit on it, Paul. I don't know. I came across this week on discipleship.org, and the contrast was set up between the approach of gathering, it kind of reminds me of the concentric circles of the Saddleback Church, bringing people from the community to the congregation, to the crowd, to the core, and then we send them out as missionaries, right? That's what you're talking about. So essentially, they become disciple makers that are prepared and mature in their character and ready to go, as opposed to this other model on the right of Jesus-style disciple making, where he had his time with the crowd, but he was selective with the group that he put most of his time and energy into. In either case, we're talking about helping others become disciple makers. I think there's no greater struggle for any of us in the ministry than to look out on a Sunday morning and wonder how many people are wrestling with a desire to make disciples in the same way that I am. How many people are with me as I'm challenging people? How do I get, whatever growing is taking place in my own life, however I've been challenged by the Lord in my own disciple-making efforts, how many people are with me in that? As a church, how are we doing? Like Scott said at the beginning, or I think it was Daryl, that we need to be always talking about disciple-making. That needs to be a constant conversation. But even when it is, sometimes I wonder, does this just become chatter and people don't really understand what it looks like? Is it happening? I think that's what you're asking, Paul.
Okay, good question. Thanks.
But
yeah, and I just want to affirm the point Paul was making. In all of my years of making disciples, I haven't put such an emphasis and an expectation that the disciples that I disciple are going to disciple others. In recent years, I've been much more insistent upon emphasizing that, even in a covenant that sometimes we do in our group. But putting that out there as an expectation from the very start, I think, is what Jesus did when he said, you're going to be fishers of men. But I think that just having it as a priority is a key point for the discipler.
Yeah, that is. Our goal is to be disciple makers, not just to be disciples. And that commission is given to each of us as individuals. That's a good point, and focusing on the end goal is a key there. Thank you, Paul, for that question, and thank you, Tim and Jimmy, for those clarifications.
I'm not sure we clarified. We might have just muddied the water.
Well, that's part of the process, isn't it? Go ahead, Tim, and tell us a little bit about this image that you've you've got for us here.
Well, this was another image I've come across that helps me keep my focus where I think it needs to be, and that is that discipleship is really the motor that runs the mission. There are a lot of things that we talk about when it comes to sharing Christ or evangelism, but yeah, I think we're all on the same page as far as that our goal is to be disciples who make disciples who makes disciples. It's got to be a multi-generational goal. And, we look at the scriptures like 2 Timothy 2:2, Paul saying, the things you heard from me, pass on to others who can pass it on to others. That's ultimately what reproduction through disciple making is all about. And as Daryl said, it happens in the context of relationship. There's intentionality to it. I liked what Jimmy said about starting our groups already declaring up front that my expectation is that you will then go and make a disciple. So there's an intentionality in that. And there has to be some kind of an effective reproduction. Some tools that I've come across recently have been designed to be simple, scalable, and sustainable. And I think when we talk about discipleship, those three words are helpful for me. If I'm thinking about a disciple who can make disciples, things that for me have become unconscious competence in the sense that I can do them almost without thinking because I've developed the ability to do them, are things that I need to help develop in others if I'm going to reproduce myself and if I'm going to reproduce disciple makers. I'm sure we're all familiar with this kind of a paradigm for development where I do, you watch, then I do, you help, you do, I help, and then you do and I watch. And that repeats itself over and over and over as we're learning different skills or moving into new areas of competency in our lives. And when it comes to disciple making, this is the slow, long work that has to be done with other people.
Tim, a question that comes to mind is how do we think of this process in the context of our churches? How do we structure ourselves? How do we facilitate this function in the life of our church so that individuals capture the vision of becoming disciple makers?
Yeah.
How does this extend to our activities and our functions as a church?
I think it comes back to where we started, and that is that if you're going to be a disciple-making church, you have to have a clear idea of what the pathway is, what the process is.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I was exposed to in coming to work with the colleague who started the ministry here was that he had sat down and identified what are the character issues, what are the knowledge issues, and what are the competency issues that a mature believer needs to have in their life. And so how are we going to get them there? And then if they're going to be a leader in the church, what are the different aspects of character, knowledge, and competency that we need to see in their life? And so I think it's a very individualistic question, which can be difficult in churches that are growing numerically rapidly, but it's something that has to be done at the individual level, asking ourselves where a person is and how we move them along in an area of growth that they need to experience. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For example, on Sunday, I will be preaching from Ephesians 4, and the big idea of my sermon is that God's work always outlasts us but never overlooks us. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be the sermon that I preach before we vote on the guy who's going to succeed me as the pastor of our church. Now, he's someone who came to us out of Bible college, so he already had some of those pieces of knowledge and preparation. But then he gained more growth in his character and his competencies over the last 7 years as he's done ministry in our context. And now we're talking about a guy who 9-10 years ago didn't even know the Lord, came to Christ, went to Bible school, ended up in our church, and potentially Sunday becomes the pastor or the lead disciple maker of our church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so there was a pathway defined over these last 7 years of what is lacking in his life and what do we need to help him to grow in.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a repetition of this cycle of bringing him from unconscious incompetence to unconscious competence in multiple areas of his life.
Mm-hmm.
And like Danilo, as in this case, there have been also elders, ministry leaders, small group leaders, all kinds of people prepared in our church to develop in things that they weren't able to do with confidence until someone came alongside them and brought them through this process.
Okay. So it's been a paradigm shift for you, focusing on disciple making, something that's very personal, individual, relational, moving people in a process toward an agreed upon goal. And then in the church together, agreeing that this is where everybody is moving at the same time. That's perhaps one of the ways that I would summarize what I heard you say. What other takeaways or what other thoughts come to mind as we kind of wrap up some of our thoughts here? Jimmy, what would you say?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to something that Daryl brought up at the beginning, and that is, at least in our international churches in the IBC, there's the element of time, and it's I think Danilo is an exception to the norm of a person in an IBC church, and that is typically we have them from maybe 1 to 3 years as opposed to 7. So it doesn't eliminate our opportunity to make disciples who make disciples, but the way that we accomplish it is going to be affected by the amount of time that we have or don't have. And so thank God for those that are around for, longer than 2-3 years. But we also need to, as an international church, assess, what can we do given the amount of time that we have, and then develop our strategy accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Good. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you.
I love how Tim put that developing people picture up there. And it just helped me visualize, I think, at least in the American church and probably in our international churches as well, the situation, like Paul said earlier, Paul Arneson said earlier, he said that, so many people are willing to be a disciple, but not so many willing to be a disciple maker. And I think this is because for decades and decades, we've sold this idea, at least the American church sold this idea that you come in and be a disciple without being a disciple maker. And so they're sitting there, according to this picture, in this unconscious incompetence, like they don't know what they don't know about being a disciple maker. Okay, and then we start preaching from the pulpit. We start preaching, that we're supposed to be disciple makers. Every one of you is supposed to be disciple makers. Well, we've just raised their consciousness, and now they realize I'm supposed to be doing this, but I just don't know how. I don't have the nuts and bolts. I don't know how to share the gospel, And so my heart hurts for we leave these people, these congregations, in this pit of despair. This was the exact scenario last night in a small group that I was leading. and all their comments just were like comments of despair. Like, we know we're supposed to do that, but I don't know how, and we can't leave them there. We've got to take them in a personal context, almost by the hand, and apply the nuts and bolts training and equipping and modeling so that they can. I don't know if that made sense, but this picture and a few other comments that were made just really brought these thoughts to a visual perspective for me.
It really is key. And the pit of despair, the interesting thing there, you'll see the ladder, and that is the leader. Leaders are ladders to bring people out of that pit of despair. As you know, when you introduce people to things that they're not good at doing, then they get discouraged. And it's the leader then that brings them out of the despair and says, you're actually at a good point right now because you've realized that this is not easy, but it can be done, and I'm going to accompany you along in your development.
The role of the leader you pointed out is crucial. It begins with vision casting and paradigm shift, and that's part of the role of leadership. We've spoken a lot about leadership and the role of vision casting. The same is true not only for how to have a healthy church, but also how to make disciple makers. The process has to be modeled. An example I've heard is put that on the table as well. And there has to be some kind of a pathway and a process. One of the questions that was asked, Judith Lynn asked about a pathway. Is something of a pathway written out, and can we share it with others? And I answered that question briefly. There are some ways that are available. There's a number of models. What I'd like to do, as I said in one of my postings, I'll share just some of the different models that I've found helpful. And perhaps that can give a beginning point for people who are looking to design a pathway that fits their context and their culture in the church. Tim, how would you answer that question about a pathway of discipleship?
I would answer it in a couple ways. I think that, and also this will relate to what Jimmy said about the short time that we have with people while they're in our churches. I think we have a unique opportunity. I was just with a friend who's building airplanes with Spirit Airlines, and he told me that the amount of people traveling is going to triple in the next 20 years. So the reality that we live in with the transient people in our churches is only going to get greater and greater, and that presents a great opportunity for us. I think that the pathway that we have as international churches might be something that we can develop together. And I've always thought that maybe in the international churches, we could have somewhat of a modular approach. If we know that Scott Corwin's church is competent in this area, well, when people spend time in his church, they could be developed in that competency. Maybe they come to Naples and gain another competency. That assumes, obviously, that they move from one IBC church to another, and we don't know that. But another part of this, I think, is in strengthening our intake, how we bring people in, how quickly we get them in. Going back to what Paul's question, how we communicate to them what it looks like to be a disciple who makes disciples. Mm-hmm. Is that going to be clear to them? Mm-hmm. And are they going to be able to see how being part of our community is going to help them to do that? Mm. I think those are things as IBC churches that we can come together and develop some resources for.
Tim, this is one of the opportunities I think we have as a network of churches, a convention, to wrestle with this question: what is a disciple-making church? And while we may have different opinions and different approaches to that, it would be helpful if we can come up with some common language as well as common focus, so that it strengthens the impact that we have as churches, not only on the individuals in our church, but also our contribution to the kingdom of God at large. It would be awesome to think that if a person came to an IBC church and spent their 3 years, that they would be able to go to either another IBC church or to even a different church and walk into that church and say, here's what a disciple is. Here's how I've been equipped to be a disciple maker. How can I plug in to be that kind of a disciple maker here?
Yeah.
Incredible
At
opportunity for us.
At least we move them one step to the right
Take that step to the right.
in the time that they're in our churches. And I think another part of the answer is that we have to model it. If we're going to lead it, we have to live it. And so that's part of the answer too, to the measurements of what mature multiplying disciple making looks like, is that they should be able to identify it in us.
Mm-hmm.
They should hear our stories. We should be sharing our experiences, our joys and our struggles, so that that becomes more of a conversation that they can picture.
That's great. Thank you for that. We've come to the end of our time. We've certainly not exhausted the answers to a question. We've started our thinking about this. So I want to say thank you, Tim, for stimulating our thoughts and helping direct our conversation when it comes to this notion of what it means to be a disciple-making church. We have an opportunity to make disciple makers of all nations in our unique context and setting. And I appreciate the way that you've led us that direction. Anybody want to just mention a takeaway, something that you're going to walk away with, either in the chat or in by voice comment as we bring our time to a conclusion here? Somebody care to just give us what's one takeaway that you're going to leave with?
For me, it's the role of the leader to cast the vision of what the ultimate end of discipleship is.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the Vine and the Trellis, they call it, a redeemed people gathered around the risen Christ. That's where we're headed.
Mm-hmm.
But by casting that vision and inviting people to take the pathway toward that vision,
Mm-hmm.
I think it helps them to see that it's not just about them. It's not just about becoming a Christian or even a disciple, but to become a disciple maker who is growing along with others and taking people along with them.
That's great. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you. Someone else?
Well, first, I'd like to respectfully request that this be part one of what a disciple making church is, and that as soon as possible we do part 2 webinar on this.
Sure.
So good. So good. And so much more to glean from there. You know, one of the things that Tim said, a lot of stuff he brought up and others mentioned too were like nuggets of wisdom, but the coolest thing I heard Tim saying, Tim, I don't know if this was intentional, but you referred to Danilo as the lead disciple maker. And when you said that, I was like, wow. You know, so many of us and pastors stand up in a church and say, good morning, I'm the senior pastor, I'm the lead pastor, I'm the connection pastor. But for that same person to step and say, good morning, I'm the lead disciple maker for this body, this community. Man, that'll flip the script right there. That'll, yeah, that rocked me good. That rocked me in a good way.
Good one. Good one. Yeah, thank you for that. Someone else, what's one of your takeaways? We won't wait too long. Judith Lynn, go ahead.
I think for me it was just an affirmation of this pathway. When I started this focus of discipleship for our church, I sort of mapped out a 3-year process and moving people from where they are to the next step, or moving them to the right. And so but just continuing to explore what should be along that pathway. What are some of those competencies or character issues that we need to include in that pathway? Or knowledge issues. What are those things that we need to add to that pathway that we've mapped out?
Good. Thank you for that, Judith Lynn. And one of the things that we might do in part 2, Daryl, you can make some suggestions as well, is we might come up with just exploring some of the different models that are available and discussing that from the point of view of the IBC. That's a possibility for sure. Paul, what's a takeaway you have?
A couple things. I think one was, I'll just mention this one, the idea of the length of time we have to do this. Jesus had 3 years. Maybe there's something about that. That's as much time as as we often get with these people. And yet it's never going to be an ended process. It's giving them the tools, the preparation, the heart, the encouragement, the skill, so that when they leave us, they'll continue on regardless. And the other thing would be, it was good to hear Tim talk about his successor as a disciple maker, because I think we're often in the role, we think of ourselves in the role of pastor, we think of ourselves as a role of disciple maker, and that means it's about the next generations, that we're always kind of an interim.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. Thanks, Paul, for that insight. Last chance, and we will close out our time together. Once again, thank you, Tim, for sharing with us, and thank you to those of you that joined us in this particular webinar. You'll receive, as a result of this, an email from me with some of the resources and web sites that are very prominent these days in the notion of disciple-making movements. Maybe that will stimulate your thinking and ideas a little bit more. If you have questions or you have recommendations for part 2 of this, just let me know, and we will get a schedule and let you know when our next webinar is coming up. So thank you for being a part of this. And as we conclude, let me do so with just a bit of a blessing. May God indeed fill us with his love, so that the grace of Jesus Christ and the power of his Holy Spirit enables us and empowers us to become disciple makers, a part of disciple-making churches. Thank you, Tim. I appreciate it, and thank you for joining us on the webinar today. Have a good afternoon.
Scott.
We'll check in. Yes.
Thanks, Scott.
You're very welcome, Tim. Thank you.